Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a twice-monthly podcast, basically, in which I, a Great Lakes novice, ask people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. My name is Stuart Carlton. I work with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant at Purdue University, and I know a lot about just how wet your feet can get on a day in which it's not supposed to rain, but it rains anyway while you ride your bike into work. But I don't know a lot about the Great Lakes. I'm joined today by Carolyn Foley. Carolyn, how are you?
I am doing well, thank you, Stuart. How are you doing? I guess you...
I got a wet foot. We had a 9:30. We're interviewing for our department head, and so we had a 9:30 meeting, so I had to pedal in fast. And it wasn't supposed to rain, but it was doing that thing where it's like the air is heavy with water and your feet are wet and you're glad you have fenders on your bike to prevent other things from being wet. And it's just generally unpleasant. But it was a nice meeting with the department head candidates, so it was all better after that, I guess.
That's good. Yes. And we are definitely in the weirdness of spring where it's like, it's snowing, it's 70 degrees, it's raining. What's it going to do next?
Yeah. It's kind of fun, though. I like it. No, last weekend was super. Oh, my goodness. Outside, I could have worn shorts, but, not everybody has a body made for shorts. But we had a good time doing the grilling and chilling, and all that was good. That actually, normally here, what I do is I insert like a really clever, more or less clever transition from our little banter into what our guests will be discussing. I do not have a clever or semi-clever transition here, so I'm just going to...
And I did not set you up particularly well, so I apologize.
I didn't set myself up, so I'll do what I do normally, but best of all is lean into the awkwardness. So I will lean straight into that awkwardness and plummet down. And we're going to talk about... actually a big thing. So a big thing that we talk about all the time is contamination in the Great Lakes, right? It's an amazing freshwater resource, but there's some significant issues with it. Human-induced issues a lot, although there's other things too. And so one of the things we always talk about are different contaminants, and there's a ton of those out there, and we love to talk with experts about the different types of contaminants. And so our guest today, she does all kinds of really interesting research. She's an environmental chemist, but you know what? I'll go into all those details in a minute. This is all just a long way of me introducing the one, the only researcher feature theme song. Researcher feature. A feature in which a researcher gonna teach us about the Great Lakes. It always seems like such a good idea when I'm like at home recording this stuff, and then when we have the Zoom on and like I'm looking at the guests and I'm like, oh, this is horrible, this poor person. But here we are. The thing is, what are you gonna do? It's not like we can not play the music. Yeah. Our guest today is Dr. Marta Veneer. She is an assistant professor in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Our huge rivals, I guess, down south, although I will be honest, I am unfamiliar with the outlines of the rivalry because I just don't care. But duly noted, so caveat, etc. Marta, how are you today?
Hi, good morning. Hi, Stuart and Carolyn. Thanks for having me. I know we should be rival, but I don't care either. That's what I hear, so I don't know.
And Purdue needs to be careful before being too, rivalacious, I think, because, they stink at most everything. Basketball is pretty good this year. Anyway, good. So environmental chemist, I don't even actually know what an environmental chemist is. How do you get into environmental chemistry? Like when you were a kid, did you have the little chemistry set where you mix in acids and bases and making explosions, or what was the deal there?
No, I actually don't have one of those stories when people say, I wanted to be a chemist since I was 5 years old. Nope, not really. I went into chemistry because I wanted to go into hard science, but I wanted at the same time something that was more tangible than physics or mathematics, or maybe I didn't think I was smart enough to be a physicist. I don't know. And then I went into analytical chemistry because I really wanted to measure chemicals, and I was fascinated by how instruments work. And then my husband got a job here at Indiana University. We were not married at the time, and I decided to follow suit. And things actually worked out serendipitously because I ended up working with one of the best environmental chemists in the world, really. I was really lucky, which is Ron Heitz. He's a guru of mass spectrometry, those fancy instruments that we use to measure chemicals. So everything worked out perfectly, or in other words, I was very lucky.
Well, you say we're lucky, but you got to be there to receive the luck, right?
Yes.
And so, yeah, I mean, of course, anytime anybody ends up in a position, you can look back and look at the lucky points, but let's not sell yourself too short there. Yeah.
And so I restarted my PhD on this side of the world. I work really on the Great Lakes. And I have to admit, I come from Italy, I didn't say this, coming from the other side of the world, Ron was surprised that I didn't know much about the Great Lakes. Everybody thinks that everywhere in the world, everybody knows about the Great Lakes. And now I agree, we should all know about the Great Lakes, but we don't. And so when I actually go to Europe and I give seminars, I show this slide where I show them that the Great Lakes occupy an area similar to the UK to sort of translate and give the impression of how important they are. So I become very passionate about the Great Lakes, and in particular about measuring chemicals in the environment. I'm very passionate about that, no matter where they are, not only the Great Lakes.
So in terms of those chemicals that you're measuring, there's a lot of acronyms that people hear in public media, but then also in scientific papers and things like that, like PCBs or PFAS or PFOAs or PBDEs or things like that. Can you help our listeners understand a little bit, like, what do those acronyms mean?
Sure. So I always joke that we should buy vowels every once in a while. These acronyms are just too much, even for me. And my students and my collaborators know that I am allergic to acronyms. So I try to spell out everything, because sometimes you get down to reading these reports and you seriously think, let's buy a vowel here, because I don't understand what we're talking about. But for chemicals, I'm guilty as charged. We use a lot of acronyms. I guess it all started with PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which are one of the largest group of chemicals that have been started being measured historically. And I have to say that we're still measuring them at levels that are above our detection limits. So we're not done with them quite yet. The other acronym that you mentioned is PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers. There's a vowel there at least, so that's easier. And those are flame retardants, and I'm very passionate about that. Those are my first love. Those are the chemicals that I done a lot of work for my dissertation and for a good part of my research. They are slightly newer than PCBs in the sense that we've started getting to know them really at the beginning of the 2000s or sort of. So they are young relatives of PCBs, so to speak. And then, of course, PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Those are the ones that everybody's talking about nowadays, because it's probably one of the biggest environmental concern after climate change, or almost at the same level as climate change nowadays.
Yeah, I want to talk about those kind of in a little bit of detail. First, though, so when you say the actual names of the chemicals or whatever, you understand why they're all the why all the acronyms exist, because it's all just a mouthful. But those terms, like, you can define those, or I mean, you hear poly blah blah blah, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, right? Yeah, those words are meaningful to you, as opposed to just for those who aren't fluent in analytical chemists, I suppose, know as much about them. That's interesting. So. Well, so you talk about PBDEs, your first love. So we like to go. So let's talk about your first love. I mean, other, of course, than your husband, who is at IU. Okay.
Of course.
Yeah. Right. We got you. But so what's the deal with these? These are flame retardants. Are those things that, like, people put in clothing, or where are these? Or is it like to in a thing to put out the fires and fire extinguishers, or where are these used?
Yeah. So flame retardants are actually used. They have a good reason, a good purpose. So they are used to prevent fires, or rather the severity of fire once fire catches on. They are added to a lot of products. So think about your sofa, the foam that is underneath the cover. Think about curtains, home insulations. And all of the electronics that we have in our homes, TVs and computers, laptops, tablets, everything that has a screen and a chip is treated with flame retardants. the backing of carpets. So unfortunately, these chemicals have become ubiquitous, meaning they're everywhere, both indoors and also outdoors. The good news is that because we have accumulated quite a bit of information about their presence in the environment and their negative health effects. So these chemicals, obviously, they're not good for our health and for the environment. And so some of these chemicals have been phased out. So if you have, for example, if you go to IKEA, you buy sofas now or anything that is upholstered, you will not have flame retardants. But this has been the situation since maybe the last 3 or 4 years. Before that, if you have an old couch or an old sofa, it's likely treated with flame retardants.
And so is I'm guessing, I'm inferring that the problem is not so much that they're in there, but they eventually leach out potentially into the environment. And
yeah.
Okay.
Imagine that every time you sit on your plunge on your sofa, you have a puff of air coming out.
Oh yeah, no, that's not that imaginary in our house. Yeah.
And now that I see Carolyn's cat, I can say that we have actually done a study on cats where we measured flame retardants, and cats have very high levels of flame retardants. And you know why? Because they tend to sit on warm electronics, like on warm stuff, and they leak themselves, and so they ingest these flame retardants. Sorry, this was a digression, but
no, that's good. Actually, so a new thing I want to do is we're going to start having a Twitter poll. So that's going to be the first thing in our new Twitter poll is, did you know that cats have high levels of flame retardant? So we'll put that up at twitter.com/our thing. Teach Great Lakes. Interesting.
Yeah, and my cats definitely, they sit on things and sometimes they chew things, and it's like, no, that's a terrible plan. So in terms of, like you mentioned about PBDEs, that we're learning more about them. So they've been around for quite a while, right? And it's just sort of over time, science catches up in terms of understanding the human health effects and things like that. You talked about machines at the beginning and how you really like those. Can you please say how you detect them in the environment? Like what types of tests you do and things like that?
We generally, we can work with all kinds of samples that can be air, water, soil, fish, you name it. You send it to us and we can test it. And we use what we call gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which is a way of measuring chemicals at very low levels. We call them trace levels. But even though they are very low levels, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned. It means that we need a very sophisticated and expensive equipment to measure them. But nevertheless, even low levels can have significant effect because we are exposed continuously. And so they add up with time.
So in terms of kind of long-term exposure, and you mentioned also earlier that this is kind of as big a threat as climate change, but it's kind of like the suite of chemicals and the constant exposure. Is that what you would say is kind of where the threat lies, that it's constant and there are so many different chemicals and they have different effects? Or is there another way of putting that?
So when I was talking about a serious environmental concern, I was referring in particular to PFAS.
Well, I was going to say we can sort of transition to that, I think, if we want to kind of introduce it broadly and then get into why it's such a big concern. But if you want to sort of put a button on flame retardants, let's do that first.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say, though, that what Carolyn was saying about the sheer variety and amount of chemicals we're exposed to every day, and the fact that chemicals have been produced and released have been steadily increasing with time, that kind of creates a dangerous chemical soup. That's why we call it what we call that. It is a concern. The good news is in that term, before we transition to that, is I want to share is that in the recent United Nations meeting, UNEA 5.2, the committee has voted to move forward with creating an intergovernmental panel, pretty much like the IPCC for climate change, but for chemical pollution and chemical waste. And this is great news. There's a lot more work to do, but at least it's a step towards recognizing that we do have a problem with chemicals that we need to address, and that requires a global effort.
Interesting. So let's talk at one of the things that'll be one of the main focuses of that global effort. Let's talk about PFAS kind of broadly. First of all, let's pretend that I already forgot what it stands for. Just for the listener, maybe they don't remember. They were at a red light and not focused. So what does PFAS stand for again?
It's pair and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals, substances.
Okay.
And the key here is the F in PFAS, which is fluorine. And fluorine is a very fascinating chemical element. It's an halogen, pretty much chlorine, so that's the C in PCBs, and bromine, which is the B in PBDEs. Those are all halogens. So there's a pattern here among all of these classes of chemicals. And in particular, fluorine is probably the most special of all of those, because when you create a bond between fluorine and carbon, you can't break it in nature. So once you release a molecule out there in the environment that has this bond, it is so strong that it can't be broken naturally.
That's bonkers.
That's bonkers. Yeah. Okay. So PFAS are they related to? I feel like they come from flame retardants or something like that. Or where do they come from? I guess. And how do these? And what do they do? I mean, obviously, we're not making chemicals just for the fun of it. Or not these types of chemicals just for the fun of it. And so what why do we make these, and what are they for?
So you're right that there was a connection with fire and flame retardants, because one of the main uses of PFAS. Sometimes I get confused between all these groups myself. So the main uses of PFAS was in the foams that the firefighter used to extinguish fires. So think about airports or military bases. And unfortunately, those have become one of the biggest hotspots for PFAS contamination, because they were used in high amounts for a very long time. But PFAS are also used in a large number of other applications. Whenever they are used, they impart to the item certain characteristics that are desirable. So they make the item water resistant, they repel grease and stain. So think about the Scotch guard treatment. When you spray on your clothes because it rains and you don't want to get wet like today. So those treatments are actually do contain PFAS. Our carpets are treated with PFAS because we don't want stain to ruin our carpets. Or another big items are anti-stick pans. So all those nice pans that you don't have to scrub anymore, those are treated with PFAS. From a chemical perspective, they were a great invention. Really, they improved the first ads that DuPont released were housewives saying, "My life has improved so much because I have non-stick pans." And it is true, it's a great invention, but it also comes with a lot of effects, and we're now paying the price for that.
They leach into the environment in various ways, right? And they have this unbreakable bond. But so what are the exact effects? Like what do they do when they? So here I am, I'm leaking chemicals. I'm into Lake Michigan, right? And so what happens as a result of those being in there?
Once a chemical is out there, this doesn't apply only to PFAS. Applies to a lot of these chemicals, especially when they have these halogens in it: chlorine, bromine, fluorine. They enter into the food chain, so they stay in water, but then they get into fish, and the bigger the fish, the higher the amounts of these chemicals. And then we as humans eat this fish, and we get the highest levels of these chemicals. And once they are in our bodies, they tend to accumulate. They accumulate in fat, or they circulate into our bodies. And so the net result of this is that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, that routinely monitors the presence of chemicals in Americans, has found out that every American has detectable level of PFAS in their blood.
And do we know the effects of that? So that's cool. Not at all cool. And so is that just, so do we just have a general concern saying this isn't right? Or do we think there might be some method by which, like this causes disease or life effects or whatever? Or is it too early to tell?
We know enough at this point to know that these chemicals are not good for our health. It's not good to have them in our bodies. And they give a wide array of possible negative health effects, going from being linked to obesity. One of the latest studies show that they diminish the effect of they diminish the immune response of our bodies. And so at the times like these where we are fighting during the pandemic, we certainly don't want to know that there's chemicals in our bodies that hamper our response to infectious diseases. But there's other possible effects like diminished IQ, neurological factors, because the reality is that we know enough to say that they're bad, but we don't know the full extent of how bad they are for our health.
Gosh, when did this start? When were they first, PFAS in particular? Like when did they first started to get introduced into the environment?
Their mass production started in the 70s, really. And there's this really nice book from Robert Bilott called Exposure. He tells his story as a lawyer in his battle against DuPont, which is the biggest company producing PFAS. And it's really interesting to see for how long these have been produced and introduced into the environment, even when the company knew that the effects were negative. So they've been out for quite some time.
So so that's really tricky. But so one thing that surprises me a little bit, I guess I didn't realize that it didn't start till like the 70s, because I'm so used to chemicals that they've been around since the 30s or whatever. So that's really interesting.
The dawn of that better living through chemistry era, right?
Yeah. And then okay, so we talked a little bit about so my cat is still sitting behind me. We talked about how like a cat might lay on things and then lick themselves and ingest things that way. We talked about like sitting down. You mentioned carpets, so I assume if we walk around, we potentially track it out there. And then you also mentioned that there are different kind of mitigation mechanisms where like you no longer have these materials in your couch if you buy a new couch. We've talked about stuff like that with microbeads too, how they're not in products anymore. Are there things that people can do short of waiting for like companies or legislators to sort of ban uses of chemicals? Are there things that people can do to sort of minimize their exposure to PFAS? Because I guess the other thing too, and I think we should link to the list of papers. Like I was looking at your publications before we spoke with you, and you've got it like they're in makeup, they're in like so many different things in different places. So are there things that people can take, steps that people can take to kind of minimize their exposure?
What I've learned with time, working not only with PFAS, but also with flame retardants, for example, is that there's a growing movement of informed consumers. So consumers are becoming more and more informed and making informed choices. This is what we can do as consumers. Make sure that you are aware of what you buy and what you use. At the same time, it is really overwhelming. Even for me, sometimes I'm stuck for weeks when I have to buy something and like, what do I need to buy? For example, I had to buy car seats for my kids. And I had just published a paper where we had reported flame retardants on car seats. And I was really, what am I going to do? What am I going to buy? And so even for me, and I know that I have a lot of information, it's really overwhelming. So I can't imagine for people who don't have all of this information. Still, it's good to stay on top of these things and be careful with what you buy. At the same time, also, there's this interesting process which we call a whack-a-mole game. I don't know if you have ever played that game where you whack.
Oh, yeah.
So this happens with chemicals. And so you may read, for example, free of BPA, right? Doesn't have any plastic. Unfortunately, most likely that item has BPS, which is a replacement. And even if you're not a chemist, you can tell that it will be a very similar molecule. And so with similar characteristics and similar health effects. And so when one chemical is pushed out, another one comes up, like in the whack-a-mole game, which is not necessarily a good cycle, because we don't know enough of the new chemical, of the new replacement. And after a few years, we realize that it's as bad as the chemical it replaced. And so this goes in full circles. And it happened with PFAS as well. So PFAS and PFOA, which we probably have heard, because we start to see on pans and pots advertised the PFAS free. But when you actually read PFAS free, it doesn't mean that it's completely devoid of PFAS. It means that it's without one or two, like PFAS or PFOA. But there will still be some other PFAS in there, just different kinds.
Yeah, but that's just the challenge with this whole deal, right? Is that, so, I referred earlier to the better living through chemistry idea of like the mid 20th century, but I mean, it's absolutely true. When you look at what is enabled thanks to, chemistry, it's just astounding. And all of these quality of life improvements, but so often it comes with, you're right, unknown at minimum, and then sometimes really deleterious health and environmental effects, and there's no way to know. But it's also like, well, gee whiz, flame retardants. I would prefer my couch not set my child on fire, and so it's just so complicated.
And let me get this straight. I'm a chemist. I appreciate chemistry. I think chemistry is very important. I'm not against chemistry. I want safe chemistry. I want safe chemicals that are not going to harm my health. And there are alternatives. There, in every single case that we've been thinking, there are safe alternatives. For example, in the case of sofas, the way we got away without chemicals was to put a barrier between the foam and the fabric that will isolate the foam from the fabric, which is the first thing that catches fire. So, but manufacturers can still meet the flammability standards without adding chemicals. So there's always alternatives. It's just a matter of going the extra mile to find these safer alternatives.
That's great. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that. I really, really appreciated that.
Yeah, actually, this whole thing has been really interesting, learning about PFAS and PFOAs and PDBs and all of this whole vowel-free alphabet soup, I suppose. But that's actually not why we invited you here on Teach Me About the Great Lakes this week. The reason that we invited you here on Teach Me About the Great Lakes is to ask two questions. And the first one is this. If you could choose to have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which would you choose?
That would be a very easy choice. A donut for breakfast.
Donut! I feel like the donut chooser is like it's less gray in the choice of donut than in any other choice. So, okay. All right, donut it is. So I have two family members who are at IU, and one day I will go to visit them. There are students there. Neither are chemists. But I will go to get a donut in the morning. And so when I'm in Bloomington, where should I go to get a delicious donut?
Ooh, I don't know. Even though I would choose a donut, we are not necessarily eating donuts all that often. And when we do, I admit that we go to Dunkin' Donut.
Okay, that's fine. Dunkin' Donuts counts.
Which you can do anywhere, so you don't need to come down here.
No, I won't go just for Dunkin' Donuts. I'll be honest. Yeah, but that's great.
Sorry.
No, that's great. We had a sandwich person pick Subway. It's all fine. All answers are good. The point is, yeah, it's all good. Great. Okay, Dunkin' Donuts it is. And the other thing we like to do is you talk about how you become passionate about the Great Lakes. And that's something I find with myself, too, as I'm learning more about them and realizing what an amazing and just irreplaceable resource this is, defined in so many different ways. Is there like a special place in the Great Lakes to you that you would like to share with our audience? And what makes it special?
So as I mentioned, I became familiar with the Great Lakes when I moved here almost 20 years ago. And one of my favorite places places is Lake Michigan. Chicago is the first place I've seen on the lakes, and I still love Chicago a lot. But I would say that because Lake Michigan is huge, I particularly love the Indiana Dunes State Park. It's an amazing place. When we went there, on the beach by the lake, it almost made me feel that this was the ocean, the sea that I miss so much. And that place is just special. It's really unbelievable.
That is amazing. Yes, and we'll put a link to that in our and all the other things we mentioned in our show notes at teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com/52, the number 52, because this is episode 52, Carolyn. Gosh. Well, Dr. Marta Vanier, an assistant professor in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Environmental Affairs is a different school, I suppose. More fun in some ways. But anyway, at Indiana University, thank you so much for coming on and teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Man, PFAS.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. I mean, you hear so many acronyms, and it was really good at, kind of splitting out, okay, here's why people are concerned about PFAS right now and why it's a huge deal and, different things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it is good. And I thought, did a really nice job. I guess when you're in the School of Public Environment Affairs, you're used to thinking bigger picture, right? As opposed to like a hardcore chemistry kind of department. But a potential all-star, I would say. Potential all-star, yeah.
And hardcore chemistry, there's a little bit of me that I'm like, I took physical chemistry for fun, like as an elective in undergrad, and there were like 7 people in the class, and they kind of went around and they were like, why are you here? I have to take it because I want to go to med school. I have to take it because I'm an engineer. And I was like, I needed an elective, and everyone just looked at me like, what? And so it's nice to think back on, because chemistry is really cool.
You took chemistry because you needed an elective. There we go.
Yep. And they were like, what is wrong with you? I like chemistry. So anyway, so what did we learn today, Stuart?
Chemistry was more organic chemistry, but that's the reason I was not an environmental studies major, was I found out you had to do organic chemistry, which at my university was a med school weed out class. And I was like, or don't. That's the thing. Or you can not take chemistry. And so I did that. And, look how far it's taken me. So it's all good. Anyway, what did I learn? The number one thing I think everybody learned is that cats have unusually high levels of flame retardants in them, which is good. We could have set up just a cat line, right? Maybe if they could do this in the next wildfire season. You just stack a bunch of cats on top of each other.
Oh my goodness. Come on, Stuart.
I mean, you could.
Oh, do you have a boo sound?
I do, but why would I play it there after a really thoughtful idea?
Yeah. Okay, well, I enjoyed learning about how there's a panel at the UN who's going to be addressing this PFAS. So part of my job is running research competitions, and in recent years we have supported a couple of different projects, and different people are supporting projects around the Great Lakes to understand where are the PFAS, what kind of effects are there, things like that. So it's cool to see. It's alarming to know that it's concerning enough for the UN to be doing a global effort, but it's also comforting to know that there's a global effort to try to address this. So
right, too bad we need a global effort. Yeah, we should. Well, we'll go into more detail now once I'm sure they'll have some products and stuff like that. So I think that'll be interesting to talk about kind of in future episodes with Marta, probably with Marta. Yeah, I agree. That was great. It was interesting to learn about it and how it's everywhere. I didn't realize it was in the 1970s when all this came about. I just don't have a good sense of the history. Something we kind of got at a lot in this show is thinking about the way that our relationship with the environment changes over time and has evolved. And, a lot of it from this more command and control, and we can fix things through science and technology to now I feel like we're in a little bit more of an era where we try to integrate some of what nature does really well into our solution. Not always, though. Like she says, one chemical goes away and then another one comes back, or one technology we find out is bad for some reason and gets filled in, and that's true. But it is interesting to see how that shifts. Or you think about like management, wildlife management, and those sorts of structures and things like that. And
yeah. Or I was spending like in my head, neonicotinoids were sparking, right? Because that's something that people used on agricultural fields, and they found out that they were problematic for bees, which is a huge issue. But then the same kind of thing, like what she said, the whack-a-mole game, where it's like, well, but if you get rid of that one, what replaces it and what will the effects there be? It's a very interesting way to think about stuff.
Yeah, it's a different thing to talk about, but I worry about that a lot in terms of like how public attention goes with this stuff. Like I remember BPA. So we found out about BPA and it disappeared overnight. I mean, they found out that it had a problem in can liners and very quickly that was gone and it was replaced by this other thing, which may be just as, and there isn't the same sustained, a very broad thing I wonder about is our ability as a populace to sustain attention on something and not get distracted by silliness. But I don't want to talk about that too much, mainly because we are fundamentally silly and I worry about our listenership if people dial back on the silliness. So
you can see the picture of my cat that we're going to stack on top of each other. It's like the end of Inside Out where it's like, I would die for Riley. Anyway,
I will trust you on that. I will see Inside Out at some point, but as you know, my kids can't handle narrative. So we'll get there. All right. Do you want to do the thing or do you want me to do the thing?
Sure, I can do it. Teach Me About the Great Lakes is brought to you by the fine people at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. We encourage you to check out the great work we do, including work in pollution prevention, at iiseagrant.org and at ILIN Sea Grant on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. Teach Me About the Great Lakes is produced by Hope Charters, Carolyn Foley, Megan Gunn, and Irene Miles. Ethan Chitty is our associate producer and fixer. Our super fun podcast artwork is by Joel Davenport.
Joel.
The show is edited by the absolutely awesome Quinn Rose, and we encourage you to check her work out at aspiringrobot.com. If you have a question or comment about the show, please email it to teachmeaboutthegreatlakes@gmail.com or leave a message on our hotline at 765-496-IISG. You can also follow the show at Twitter at Teach Great Lakes. Thanks for listening and keep grading those lakes.
But so grackles, you know these grackles? Do you know about these things? Like really annoying birds?
Yes.
And they sound, but have you ever noticed
they sound very loud?
Yeah, they sound like evil. Like they are the birds aren't real people. Like I think grackles probably started it because they sound like robots. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, we had a cat when I was in like high school who was just he was hilarious. He would like lie under. I know you were going somewhere with your birds aren't real thing, but like the cat would just lie underneath this grackle nest, and they would just like berate him, and he did not care. He's like, yeah, whatever, because he would go high. He was really good at going up and stealing their babies. And so yes, we were serenaded with grackle stuff all the time, and they were just like so ticked at him. He was just like, what? His name was Lambert. He was a funny cat. Anyway,
he was really good at going up and stealing their babies. Oh my god. No, what I was going to say, so I was out there and they were coming to our house and annoying me or whatever, and I realized the appropriate name for them, because I find their noise to be like disquieting. Like I'm it's like, yeah. So I realized it's a Decepticon of grackles. That's what it is.